Cinemodities, late night movies with Rob and Zack. This is a podcast about cinematic oddities, where we discuss any media that is too bizarre, abnormal, or off-kilter for contemporary audiences. Occasionally these projects gel, most times they crash, hard into the realm of obscurity. Join us as we delve into the cult classic swamp. I'm Zack.
And I'm Rob. And today on Cinemodities, we have a very special occasion, our first guest. And so, to frame this, this is a guest that I think Zack has promoted. When he first came to me, I said, "Guest, what do we need a guest for? Do you want to talk to other people, Zack? What, am I not good enough for you?" But he framed it in a very nice way for me and said, "No, I know someone who has this new documentary. It's about the Titanic. It's something you need to see, Rob." And so he's convinced me, and I'm very happy to introduce, we have Ryan Katzenbach with us for Titanic, Sinking the Myths. Ryan, thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you, Rob. Thank you, Zack. I was not aware that I was the first guest, so that definitely puts a little pressure on to really bring it tonight. So, but thanks for having me, and thanks for obviously for promoting the film. Always good to get the word out and let people know when and where they can see it. And it really kind of was a labor of love, and it took about a year and a half to make the thing. So, very glad it's done.
Well, that's one thing. When I had my Star Wars podcast and I had my very first guest on there, they had the same feeling you're having, Ryan, with all the pressure. And I don't see it that way. I see it as you're our good luck charm. Being our first guest, that's the good luck we're going to have that's going to carry us throughout our multi-year run.
Well, I don't know if I've ever been associated with good luck before, but we'll give it a shot and see what happens.
Ryan is here to discuss his film Titanic, Sinking the Myths, which is a docudrama about the sinking of the Titanic and all sorts of controversy and stuff that goes along with the sinking. That's one thing you don't usually associate with Titanic is controversy. But before we get into that, Ryan, would you mind giving like an introduction about who you are? What, other than the director of this film, what else do you do?
Well, I produced a documentary that was actually the first documentary that I ever produced. To back up, I originally started back in the 90s as sort of a small press publisher of books. And I actually met Diana Bristow, who wrote the book that Titanic Sinking the Myths is based on, and she sort of dragged me kicking and screaming into the publishing business. And then a few years later, we sort of began, strangely enough, to branch off towards direction towards Hollywood. And I never, as a kid, I never aspired to be a filmmaker or aspired to be a producer or a director or anything like that. I wanted to be a writer, and that was what I thought I was going to do. And I have somewhat of a journalism background. And like I said, never planned to go into filmmaking, never planned to do that. But we made a documentary on the Amityville murders, which most people, when they hear the word Amityville, they associate with the haunted house. But what a lot of people don't realize is that the year before the Lutzes moved in and fled and claimed that the house was haunted, there had actually been a really horrific tragedy in the house. Ronald DeFeo Jr., he was known to his family and friends as Butch. He was 23 at the time. He took a high-powered Marlin hunting rifle from room to room in the house and executed his entire family at 3 o'clock in the morning as they slept. And he was ultimately arrested. He didn't get away with it. He was ultimately arrested and put on trial, convicted. Today he is serving 6 consecutive life sentences in New York. And I had a lot of questions about sort of how how one person could kill their entire family on 2 different levels of a house, and no one woke up, no one got out of bed. And that was kind of the burning question that carried me into that project. Initially, we sold the film to Sony Television Pictures, and it was going to be a movie of the week on the USA Network. And, I don't even know if the USA Network is even still around today. Anyway, we went through development for about 3 years or so with that film. And I had been in development with 20th Century Fox with the FX Studios a couple years before that. And it just didn't seem like my work was getting produced. Everything was constantly going into turnaround, or there were management changes or whatnot. And so in 2005, when the option with Sony expired on the Amityville movie of the week, and it became evident that we were not going to get this made, not through a network or not through a studio, I decided at that point to make it independently as a docudrama. And so we set about doing that. It took us basically 6 years to make it. There were a lot of trips to New York. There was a lot of persuading people, various people who had never been interviewed before or never participated or told their story. It was like pulling teeth to get people to participate, but we finally managed to pull it off. The Reels channel happened to see a DVD of the film, and they actually wanted to pick it up as a 2-hour special. So we sold it to Reels or I should say licensed it to Reels in October of 2014. It debuted. It had massive ratings. It did incredibly well, to my utter shock, and which is thrilling. I mean, it's great to have something that's a huge success. And so immediately afterwards, a few months after that, I was talking to the SVP of acquisitions and development over at the network, and we just happened to sort of stumble into a conversation about projects I had sitting on the shelf, things I wanted to do, and the Titanic came up. And the next thing I know, I am in development on Titanic Sinking the Myths, and we were greenlit, and we ran off and made the film, which I never really thought we would ever get to make.
I had watched that after I'd seen Sinking the Myths, and I remember just enjoying, because I loved the pacing of it. There's one thing, like, I'm a big fan of, like, the original Unsolved Mysteries, like that, like, first 5 or 6 years of that before Lifetime got their hands on it and kind of ruined it.
Right.
And that's one thing, like, I love these kind of, like, macabre stories that aren't like what's it, Ghost Hunters with Zack Baggins, where he just sees a shadow and he screams and yells for 5 minutes. Like, right. I love that spooky ambiance, and nothing does that anymore. So, like, when I do find something like that that's contemporary, I kind of just latch onto it, and I'm watching it. I'm like, wow, because I didn't think of, like, I usually I get hooked on something. I don't go near my phone or anything like that, and so I'm waiting for it. Obviously, I watched the whole thing through, and I'm getting to the credits, and I'm like, I want to know who made this, and I saw your name, and I'm like, I know that guy. I harassed him on Twitter about books. And it was just one of those things where it's like, it's so great. Again, I guess it really is a small world. Just the fact that, again, Ryan, I am a fan of your work beyond your Titanic stuff.
Well, thank you very much.
Rob and I recorded an episode earlier today just talking about your film in general, just kind of like the warm up, prepare for this. Okay. And we were talking about that, and we described your film like a lot of Titanic documentaries, like half of it is just explaining to you the ship and the sinking, like stuff that everybody knows. It's like a Cliff Notes version of like the whole idea of everything going on. And we said your film gets what it takes most Titanic documentaries an hour to do. Your film gets through with that in about 5 minutes. It's just the entire backstory's out of the way, and then it pushes you into the deep end of the pool. And
yeah,
it's like we're getting into this stuff. You're getting into the weeds, and it's gonna be fun.
Well, that is a very true statement that you made. Was we felt like we had so much dense material to deal with that originally, I contracted with the network to make a 2-hour film. And of course, you realize a 2-hour film is not really 2 hours. A 2-hour film is 88 minutes when you count in the commercials. And we had a lot of ground to cover in 88 minutes. And you can't, I mean, just the discussion alone of how the International Mercantile Marine was formed, and J.P. Morgan, and the financing behind Titanic, and who owned her, and how that came to play in the sinking. That was something that was incredibly dense to deal with, and it had to be broken down so that it was interesting to the guy at home. Because, I mean, I could drone on for an hour about the intricacies of how J.P. Morgan acquired the Leyland line, and then he acquired the White Star, that, and most people, if you give them a topical enough explanation of that with enough detail in it, it works. So we had to literally, as you said, get the get the backstory, the stuff that everybody knows. We had to get that in, get that out, and be done with it. And I thought that Ken Marshall, when Ken Marshall, who is just the premier Titanic visual artist, Ken was absolutely great at providing, that sort of back and forth that him and I had in the first 7 minutes of the film, of covering the whole story. And once we got that done, I kind of sighed in relief, and said, okay, here we go. Now we're going, as you said, into the weeds with the story that no one has ever heard before. So, that was really, for me, where it was at in telling Diana Bristow's story.
I do want to say right off the bat, Ryan, you made a great point. You brought up, in a 2-hour movie, I'm doing air quotes for the 2 hours, because of course you have commercials and stuff like that. What information do you convey? What information do you try and make accessible to, the common man at home? And it's become somewhat of a thing on this podcast where it's just a fact that I am not the exemplar for the common man. So I can tell you, Ryan, for a fact, I absolutely loved the details you gave about the finances behind the Titanic. I first studied in actuarial science, and so just kind of the idea of the financing and the insurance behind it was incredibly interesting to me. And I'm the type of person who would listen for an hour or 2 hours about that stuff. And that's something I really liked about this documentary or docudrama, was just this amount of detail you put into some of these things that don't usually get focus in at least what I see of the Titanic and its history. And so that was something I extremely enjoyed, all of that dense factual information. That was great for me. I was excited by that the whole way through.
Awesome. Well, what you had, kind of what the goal was too, is, we had Diana's book, which was 400, I think it's like 485 pages, 490 pages, something like that. So obviously there was a tremendous amount of material in that book. And so when the project was greenlit, the very first step was, they said, it's kind of that, it's like an oh God moment, because you sign the papers and they cut you a check and they say, okay, go make the film. And now you kind of go, oh shit, what have I done?
I have to do it.
I have to do this now, and the most daunting thing, the filming, nothing scared me except for adapting her book and doing it justice, because I had 500 pages and I had to suck the marrow out of the book and get in all of the key things that if she were alive, that I would know that she would have insisted upon, mm-hmm. And at the same time, there was stuff that was not in her book. So, you saw when we went and we interviewed Charles Morris, who wrote a terrific book called, The Tycoons, okay? And then you had Stephen Gettleman, who wrote a fantastic book that was really very specific about Morgan and the IMM, And so I went, I found those guys, and those guys really helped bring that narrative to life, and they did a phenomenal job. And then, of course, we had the various historians like William Roca from the South Street Seaport Museum in New York. He was great. And so, it was the thing with the J.P. Morgan, the whole thing is the scenes that were shot of Morgan were literally an afterthought. It was the network coming to me, and the network had seen the first rough cut. We went through several of them. The network saw the first rough cut, and they said, well, this history is really good, but is there a way to lift it off the page? Is there a way to make it more visual? And what we ultimately agreed upon was we agreed that, okay, well, let's do recreations. Let's cast JP Morgan. Let's put this on its feet and give a visual and bring this character out of the history books. And I don't know how much you guys know about Morgan, but Morgan suffered from rosacea as a child and really throughout his life. And that rosacea badly scarred his face and particularly his nose. And his nose became later in life just enormous. It was this enormous bulbous nose. And of course, one of the issues is, how do you cast this guy? How do you do this? So I literally had my makeup artist, come in. I sent her pictures of the actor that I cast. I sent her pictures of JP Morgan, and I said, I need that nose. And she came back about, a week later with some preliminary pictures that she had done. They were great. And then she shows up on location that morning, and she shows up with this like huge bulbous white latex nose. And I'm like, how are you going to make that work? And I'm very skeptical. And she proceeds to put the nose on, and then she proceeds to do all of the blending and the airbrushing and all that. And when she got done, I was in awe. I'm like, holy shit, we have JP Morgan standing here, And those scenes became some of my favorite scenes in the movie. Obviously, you guys have seen the 2-hour version. You haven't seen the director's cut yet. There is a lot more drama in the director's cut with JP Morgan. We go more extensively into the aftermath and the repercussions felt by the IMM and basically what happened. They stared down the barrel at that time in 1912. They were staring down the barrel of about $16.6 million in litigation. And to put that into perspective, Titanic cost $7.5 million to build. So the liability that they were potentially facing was more than double, and this would have been something that would have destroyed most companies. And in the end, the American and British laws, the statutes of what would we call it, statute of limitation, but that doesn't sound right. But I think it is. They basically barred the high liability that should have fallen onto IMM. They basically stopped it. So IMM walked out paying about $660,000 in claims total. And as I said, that comes out to about $450 per person that they killed. That's kind of a shocking number. It put a price tag on people's lives, And so, the director's cut, you're going to see a lot more of the recreations. There's going to be a lot more information in it. The network is going to be airing that, I do believe, later this spring. So I'm very excited to see that happen. The director's cut, which is 4 hours long, okay, so it's basically 2 88-minute installments, was one of those things that I did not plan. Again, I signed a contract for a 2-hour special, and I began shooting this thing, and I began shooting interviews, and we began shooting recreations. And like I typically do, which I can kick myself for sometimes, I kept saying, oh, well, wouldn't it be really cool if we did some extended scenes on the atheist? What if we did this? What if we did that? So I kept, after I wrote the pre-shoot script, I then, like an idiot, just kept writing more. And I kept bringing actors back. And I kept, I just kept re-envisioning what I was doing. And all of a sudden, we hit the editing stage. And this thing is a beast. And I'm like going, holy crap, I've shot something that's 4 hours long. And the network and we had this discussion about it. And they were like, well, we only want 2. And I'm like, but I want to air 4. And so we ended up like making a compromise. It was like they ended up taking both versions of it, and I am thrilled with them for that. That was really, the Reels channel is truly a terrific network to do business with. They pretty much sort of they tell you what they want you to do. You sign the papers, you do your thing, and they provide notes, they provide input, and it's a very stress-free way to be creative and way to make films. So, and I love the fact that they readily take on these sort of controversial subjects, So we ended up with both cuts getting picked up, and I'm very excited to get the director's cut on the air. And I think that's really going to be, a cut that's really going to excite and enthuse audiences out there. At least I hope. So that's what's coming.
Because Reels airs this, I don't want to say sporadically, but it shows up every once in a while on the channel lineup. I DVR'd it, and I burned it to a DVD, and that's how I give it to neighbors, I give it to friends, and they give it back to me. Any chance of a home video version? I feel bad doing this. Like, I want to give you my money for an official version. That's how I shared it with Rob. I shared with him my physical copy, and I feel bad because I have tons of movies. I like buying physical media. I like having it on my shelf. Is there any way of a physical? I know obviously everybody uses their DVDs now as coasters. Like, I get that, but like, is there any way that you would I don't know, like, even if this is off the record, so to speak, like, is there any way I can buy a copy for like $30 or something? Like, I want an official copy.
We do not. I've had the same questions like the Amityville special, the 2-hour version of the Amityville special. My answer is, my feeling on it is this is my loyalty to the network, because I have the DVD rights. I kept the DVD rights. I kept foreign rights. I kept all of that stuff. And my feeling on it is, I don't want to dilute what the network, I don't want to sell DVDs, and I don't want to dilute the fact that people will go back again and again and again to the Reels channel, and they will watch that show, and Amityville was a classic example of that, because every time they aired it, the ratings were really, really good on it. And my feeling was, if I sell you a DVD and the DVD is on your shelf, then you can watch it whenever you want. So if you see it on Reels, you're going to surf past it. And as a filmmaker, I kind of need those numbers, because I like the fact that our shows, that the Catco Media shows, rank high and do well, because it keeps the development people interested in what I'm doing. So by not selling DVDs, I feel like I'm doing myself and the network a little bit more justice. Although, obviously it's nice to sell DVDs. You make a few bucks off of that. But the other thing too, as I'm sure you guys are aware, is, DVD, like you said, Zach, people use them as coasters anymore. I mean, I still, personally myself, I still like DVDs better than anything else, because I don't want to watch it on my computer. I don't want to watch, I have a projector in the living room with surround sound. So I like to go in and pop the DVD into the Blu-ray, and watch it on my wall, which is how I screen my own films, when I want to watch cuts of them. And so there's nothing like a good old DVD. But I would say that sometime in the future, after the film is several years old, there is a possibility that, it could, I could break down and release it to DVD.
All right, I just want to put that out there, that you said a year, 5, 10, 20 years from now, if you ever get to the point, again, who knows what media will be on. We'll be on 8K resolution by that time. I want the 8K cut, the 8K 4-hour cut of Titanic Sinking the Mist. Just putting that out there, that I'll be the first person in line.
I'll keep that in mind. But also keep in mind, it probably won't look very good in 8K, because we shot it native. It was shot native 4K. And so it looks beautiful in 4K, but I don't know if it'll step up to 8K. I mean, technology's getting better and better and better all the time. I've seen them in some of the post houses in LA, I've actually had them do it for me. I've had them take standard definition stuff and step it to 1080 or step it to 4K, and it's really amazing because it doesn't get better. The quality's never going to be true 4K or true 1080, but it looks really good. It definitely doesn't lose anything going up, So I suppose someday down the road, maybe your wish will be granted.
All right. Fingers crossed.
I would say, regardless of how good the 8K looks, in the more near future, when there's a big premiere or a big viewing of the 4 hours director cut, Zack and I want an invite. Maybe that's a better way to put it.
Okay, there you go.
Because I agree, I would love to see it as well. I would be totally on board for 4 hours of Titanic documentary. So I do have to say that in one of your responses from a little while back, I don't know, Ryan, you must be reading my mind or something, because I didn't even tell Zack I had this question. But one of the things that I thought when I watched this movie was, what was up with J.P. Morgan's nose? But you answered it already, so I'm blown away that you've answered my question before I even asked it. Great.
Well, if you go back, if you Google J.P. Morgan, you'll get a bundle of pictures that will come back, and his nose. We literally, because my fear in doing that was that I didn't want to make him look ridiculous. I didn't want to make him look cartoonish, and that was one thing I was stressing to makeup was like, take his nose, and if you want to downsize it a little bit, you can do that. Don't exaggerate it. Don't make it bigger. And I thought she did an amazing job on it. It really turned out very, very well. And the actor playing, there's a great moment which you've seen a tiny little piece of in the 2 hour version, where Morgan they're in the boardroom and he's saying, I lost a lot of friends in this, blah, blah, blah. And he goes into literally a tirade about, he's telling everybody to shut up basically and to get word to Senator Smith that he's not to pursue the following lines of questioning, blah, 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 blah. They don't want the German liner brought up. They don't want the bunker fire, covered too thoroughly. The fact that that Titanic turned away the Frankfurt, they are, he's and the performance when I yelled action, the performance was so amazing that we were all on set. We were all standing here and we're watching him deliver this monologue, and he delivers the last line, and it was like literally, I forgot to say cut. I just stood there and I'm like, finally I realized, I'm like, cut. I mean, it was amazing to watch his performance, and you're going to see a lot more of that in the 4 hour director's cut. That performance was not wasted. It did not get left on the cutting room floor.
Well, one question I have about this I know we'll see the 4 hour cut eventually, but as we described it, this is a very advanced documentary docudrama.
Okay.
Now, and because one thing we talked about, Rob and I, was that obviously you had to condense a lot of this information. Like I'm holding the book in my hands right now, and Sinking the Mists, and like I said, that is a dense book. It's essentially like a research text. It's not just because Rob was asking me about it, and he's like, "Well, what's it about?" And to be fair, I haven't gone through the entire thing still. But like, he's like, "Is there a story? Is there like subplots?" And I said, "No, it's a research text. Yes, and it's not just simply like adapting like a novel or a novella." Or it's like, that's easy. And so I'm looking at this, and we're kind of talking, because we mentioned offhand the 4 hour cut, and we're like, a 4 hour cut, you can do a lot of information. And we're like, maybe the reason why this film comes across much more dense, because a couple of times, as I've seen this now at least half a dozen times, if not more. I was preparing for tonight, and I was rewatching it over the last few days, and I had to keep rewinding it, and I'm like, wait, did I catch that right? Go back, listen to it, then go back. Okay, maybe like a third time's the charm. And so my question is, you had to take all that, again, like you said, 400 and something pages, and then condense it from a 4 hour cut to a 2 hour cut.
Right.
How did you do that?
very carefully. That was one of the hardest. That was one of the hardest things that that I had to do. Actually, we had finished the film. We had some post work and color correction and stuff to do in the fall of, let's see, that was the fall of 2016. And so actually my cast and crew screening that we had in Burbank, the cast and crew screened the actual director's cut. They saw the 4-hour version. And I had to explain to them that we have to cut this down now because the 4-hour was finished before the 2-hour was. So I literally made a copy of the 4-hour and then began just paring it down a little bit at a time. Slice, and then literally time it and say, okay, well, we got to lose 40 minutes more. So you go back and you cut and you cut and you cut, and at the end of that cut, you've cut 6 minutes of the 40 off. So then you're like, okay, I got to cut deeper. So then you go back and you start. I mean, it's really difficult at times because you're really making a decision about. We call it in the film business, if you ever hear the expression, killing your babies. Okay, that's what they call it. That's when you have to throw something out because it was your baby. It was a love. It was something that you shot that you really wanted to include, but you get to post and it doesn't work. And you have to throw it out. I'll give you an example of that was when we did Amityville. I had this crazy vision in my head when I first wrote the preliminary script for the pre-shoot script for Amityville. I had this crazy idea that I was going to have Don DeFeo, one of the murder victims, tell the story from beyond the grave using I thought it was a pretty high concept kind of thing, and I thought it was going to work really, really well. And we literally shot it. And we started editing it together, and it was horrible. I mean, it was absolutely horrible. It did not work. It interrupted the pacing of the film. The concept was there on paper, but it just didn't play. So literally, that just went into the scrap bin. Never to be seen by anybody other than me. So those are the kind of things. And in the case of Titanic, you had so many facts and details that affected other facts and details, so you had to be careful what you cut here. Like, for instance, Rob, going back to the JP Morgan thing, you had to tell enough of the JP Morgan story, okay, in order to set up where you were going later on. And if you diminish that too much and you cut too much out of that, then you run the risk that the audience that you're not paying it off later on and helping the audience to understand what they're seeing. So it was cut, and it probably took me a month to get that thing just of cutting and piecing it together to get it down. And in the end, I thought that the 2-hour flowed very well, and it definitely had a very expedient pace. And one of the things I watch, when I do watch TV, which is not very often, I watch Investigation Discovery, or I'll watch reels like the Autopsy show that they have, or Murder Made Me Famous, or one of those kinds of things. And one of the things that drives me nuts, and I'm not knocking anybody's work, I understand the format, but is how when you get to a commercial break and they leave you kind of hanging on a cliffhanger here. And then you come back from a commercial break and they proceed to then waste the next 2 minutes recapping what you already saw.
Yep.
And both Amityville and Titanic did not do that. I mean, I might have backed it up a few seconds from when I brought you back in from a commercial break. But I can't stand that. I don't need to be told something over and over and over again, to hammer it home. And a lot of times, sometimes I watch stuff and I watch an hour-long show and I think, that could have been done in 30 minutes. I could have done that show in 30 minutes and made it work, and you kind of get the feeling sometimes like they're just filling time. And I don't ever want to make things wherein I feel like I'm just filling time.
I never thought about that, but you are absolutely right. I see that all the time in shows, because whenever I watch stuff, it's usually through streaming, or I'm watching it with as little commercials as possible, and I get that sense. It's some reality show, and I'm just watching what happened before the commercial break that I didn't get to see, and it's so upsetting.
Right.
And
right.
I have so much. That's great. I'm so happy you've made me realize that your documentary doesn't do that. And even though I think some of the commercial cuts are a little strange, they're in weird places, I think, we never get just like, oh man, I've seen this for the last 5 minutes. It really does keep that pace.
Well, and you know, like the commercial cuts, you know, what you have to realize with the commercials is when you make something for TV, they give you what's called the clock. Okay, and the clock says, okay, you have 8 segments in a 2-hour special. Okay, and so your first one is 18 minutes, and it's followed by 7 10-minute segments. Now, the beauty of like, again, working with reels is that they said, well, you don't really have to follow that. You know, if you want to do 17 minutes instead of 18, take a 4-minute commercial break, and then come in with an 11-minute segment, that's fine, as long as it totals 88 minutes in runtime. And so some of the commercial breaks, some of the segments, you might know, some of them ran a little long, some of them ran a little short. And the reason being was because you had to sort of get to that, you got to sort of that point, and you realized that, okay, I'm at 7 minutes. And the next segue that I'm going to go into is going to take 7 more minutes to tell that. And I opted instead then to go with a commercial break at the 7 minutes, okay, and then start the next segment clean, where I knew I would have enough time to be able to cover that sort of subject matter. You know, if you go back and you sort of watch the film, you will, if you pay attention, you'll see sort of a compartmentalization of the subjects. You know, we have obviously the collision, and we talk about the damage, we talk about what the iceberg did to the ship, and then we're done with that. And now we start talking about the coal fire and going forward, and the lifeboats, and getting the passengers ready, and what was going on with Tietze Hedema and Bill Mueller, and Mueller's muse, the stewardess Gwen, and all of that. So it really, there's kind of a methodology when you make a film, and especially when you make something for TV, you know. And so that there, I'm giving you some of the behind the scenes nuts and bolts as to how you edit for TV.
Oh, yeah, and that's great. I don't even know how I would go about that. You know, you mentioned it before, the idea of, I've never heard the phrase, but I feel like I've lived it in my own work. Killing your baby, I think you put it very bluntly. I have to do that all the time. When I write for research papers or my own career, I always get that people say I'm too verbose. They're like, you have to cut it out. And I'm always like, no, everything matters. Every step is there, and you have to cut it. So I can't even imagine what it would be like to cut stuff out for commercials. That is something completely foreign to me. So it's so interesting to get that perspective. That's great.
Well, we definitely have to pay the bills, and commercials are definitely the way that we do that. And so you love them, you hate them. You know, I mean, it's like, you know, I would roll up on something. One of the things that you deal with, you know, like for instance is, let's say that you have a 10-minute segment, and you get it all timed out, you get it all put together, and guess what? You're at 10 minutes and 24 seconds. You've got to lose 24 seconds. And the hardest thing in the world, I mean, you say, oh, well, it's 24 seconds. That can become the hardest cut that you have to make, because you're literally like slicing words off of what people said, you know, just to get that. If I cut that clip, I can get 3 seconds right there, you know, and you just compress and squeeze until you get it. And so it's one thing to deal with being 40 minutes over your runtime, but it's another thing. It's even worse in some cases to be 20 seconds over.
Oh man, oh yeah, you are. I think even though we are, I think it's very clear that if Ryan works on things very different from what Zack and I work on, it is great to hear that we have all the same issues with the tiny details, the big details. That's great. Oh man, no, I love this behind the scenes stuff. This kind of in the making. I do have a question. It might have been better a little earlier on, but I'm really interested in, with all of this information you had about the Titanic and from Bristow's book, what was the motivation to make it a docudrama and not just go straight into documentary status? TV is really changing a lot. Documentaries when I was growing up, if you watched a documentary was like talking heads and archive footage and pictures and all that kind of stuff. And I, at heart, I kind of wanted to get into feature films, and I've written some screenplays for feature. And so to me, doing the film in sort of the style of a docudrama, the way that I've done it, it's very creatively satisfying for me, because I feel like I'm straddling the fence. I'm on one side here, I am making a documentary, but on the other side, I feel like I'm making a movie. And I think when you bring those two elements together and you get away from the mundane, of the talking head, and obviously my films have that. And, the people that I tend to interview, I think are great. They're always at the top of their game. But, to me, when I can show people, when I can put them on the deck of the Titanic, and I can show them the story visually, I think that's way more powerful. And that's why I tend to lean towards the docudrama style that I religiously use. Wow, that's a great answer, because I never thought about it that way. The way that I come at a lot of this stuff is just give me the information. And so Zack knows this, and I mentioned it before. Like I said, I'm not the exemplar for the common man and what the masses like to see. I don't want romance. I am one of the people who are like, if you have information, just give it to me. Don't give me the human element. But that's a really good point that you make, in that when you are framing something around, it's not even just a movie, it is about the Titanic maritime disaster, there is an inherent human element, and you should be putting people, like you said, on the deck of the Titanic.
Right.
Great. That's you sold me. That's a reason to put that human element in there. Fantastic. When I watch this again, I'm going to see it in an even new light.
Well, and you'll see, again, to go back to the director's cut, you'll see more in the director's cut of that human story. Diana was. I should probably tell you guys kind of sort of how I got into the Titanic. And I, as a kid, I was your weird kid, and I'm probably an even weirder adult.
You're in good company.
I sense that, yes. And I always had probably an unnatural or weird curiosity about things. I would get caught up in something, and I wouldn't, I would be fascinated with it, and I had to read everything about it, and I had to know all I could. So when I was 10 years old, so this would have been September of '85, Dr. Robert Ballard found the Titanic, and they had been looking for Titanic there had been numerous expeditions out to try and find it, and no one had been able to locate it. And so I see on the news, as a 10-year-old kid, I see on the news, because I watched the news as a 10-year-old kid, oddly enough. And I see this, I was fascinated with the visuals that I was seeing of the bow underwater and all that stuff. And of course, at that time, they were just using basically the cameras were on a sled that was going over top of the wreck. So the footage that we were sort of seeing was like aerial from above. We weren't getting a lot of really good visuals of the side of the ship or getting inside the ship itself or anything like that. But one of the clips that they showed was the final plunge of the ship from the 1953 Clifton Webb Barbara Stanwyck movie Titanic. And I remember just watching this ship, standing on a 45, 50 degree angle and sliding, beneath the waves, which today we know that is not even remotely accurate as to how the ship went down. But I remember just being captivated by that. And then I followed along and I started reading books about the Titanic. And then the following summer in July of '86, Dr. Ballard went back with Alvin, which was the manned submersible. And he went down to the wreck. And I remember one of the things that just blew my mind was that he drops Jason Jr., the camera system, down this open hole in the top of the Titanic where the grand staircase once stood. And he goes down several decks and voila, there's a chandelier hanging from the ceiling. And I just remember being mesmerized by that. The idea that something could be 13,000 feet beneath the ocean in incredible conditions. It's just above freezing down there year round. It's in complete darkness. There's 6,500 pounds of pressure per square inch at that depth. So the idea that you begin seeing wine bottles and dishware and all this amazing stuff on the bottom that survived, that really pulled me even deeper into the Titanic story. So I was really even more enamored and more fascinated. And sometime later, I think it was about a year later, there was an article in we had a big regional newspaper, the Columbus Dispatch, and the Columbus Dispatch has an article on this guy named John Whitman, and John Whitman is obsessed with the Titanic. And John Whitman has this huge collection of books and memorabilia and stuff that he's run all over the place collecting. And so John is going to open a museum. So I, as a 12-year-old kid, something like that at that time, contacted him and was interested in seeing his collection of what he had. So he invited myself and my parents, took me over to where he was opening this museum up, and met him. And I ended up for the next few years running tours in the museum when I was 15, 16, 17 years old. And it happened that Diana Bristow crossed paths with the museum, and she was excited about what John was doing in his museum and all of his. He was a really great Titanic artist, and he did a lot of work. He owned an art school, and he did a lot of work, capturing imagery of Titanic and painting all these huge murals and all this stuff. So Diana came up to the museum for a book signing, and Diana, I was 14, 15 years old, I think 14. And Diana was, I would hate to say, she'd kill me, but I would say probably about 60 at the time, and she was a very unique lady. She was a member of Mensa. I think her IQ, she told me at one point, was like 160 or 170. I mean, she was off the charts. And she had been a stewardess with Eastern Airlines, which, was one of the predominant premier airlines in American history, dating back to the 1930s, 1940s. And she had a vast knowledge of how crews responded to accidents, of how they were trained. And when she retired from Eastern in 1985, she said, okay, I'm retired. I have all this time on my hands. I'm going to write a fiction novel, and I'm going to write a book based on, it's going to be a romance set aboard the Titanic. So she set out and she began researching. She began reading all these books on the Titanic because she wanted the historical, the backdrop to be as accurate as she could get it. And once she began reading these, she began to sit here and she said, these crews sound, the Titanic's crew sounds like they're incompetent. Okay, and she said, I cannot believe that the White Star Line would send these clowns out with their crown jewel ship. I mean, so she began to dig. And the thing was, being retired from Eastern, she had the ability still to travel free. So she began to go to places like Britain, and she began to go to Germany, and she began to look in places that nobody else had thought to look at. And also at the same time, here we are in the mid to late 80s. And at that time, I didn't know of anybody in the Titanic community that actually had the Board of Trade or the U.S. Senate inquiry transcripts. Now, we're talking about transcripts that are like, 1,500, 2,000 pages. And who's going to read those? And a lot of times, who's going to read those and who's going to understand them? So Diana, she began corresponding with this guy. She was introduced to him by Arnold Cludas, who was the head of the German Titanic, organization. And he had said, "Oh, you need to talk to this guy named Bill Mueller. Bill Mueller lives in Canada. He's in a rest home. He's up there in age, but he can't hear, so you really can't talk to him on the phone because he's hard of hearing. But you can write to him, and he's sharp as a tack, and he'll write back." So for like 4 years, she began consulting with him about shipping history, and he knew the stuff just like click, 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 click off the top of his head. He could tell you what line owned what and how they were tied together, how they were affiliated. He knew the tonnages, of the ships, of any liner that she brought up or whatever. And they began to correspond, and she began to write this first book, Titanic, R.I.P., Can Dead Men Tell Tales? And that was sort of the primer. That was her very first book into the disaster. And she thought that she would take some of the info that she'd gleaned from Bill Mueller, and she said, "I'm going to inspire other Titanic researchers and writers, to go further, to look at some of the issues that I'm going to raise and to go further with the story." She really, honestly, had no intention of writing Sinking the Myths. But then when RIP came out, when RIP came out, the Titanic organization, as she called, which was all the recognized experts like your Walter Lords and whatnot, Walter Lord being the author of A Night to Remember, which, put the Titanic story on the map in the 50s when he wrote his nonfiction novel on the disaster. And Diana, thought she was going to do RIP. She thought she would release the book, and that was it. She was moving on. The establishment savaged her so bad that it really pissed her off. And when you pissed her off, then that's when she was like a dog with a bone at that point. And she said, "You know what? They challenge my research. They challenge what I'm saying." And her favorite expression was, she would always say, "I do not deal in theory. I deal in fact." And what is in the book is fact. So she made up her mind in about I suppose it was about 1990. She had contacted me, and she had made up her mind that she was going to write one book. And this one book was going to revisit everything that was in RIP, and it was going to expand upon it to the point where no one would be able to refute her. And that's what she did. So she began writing. Well, in the meantime, she had built a friendship with John Whitman at the Titanic Memorial Museum in Ohio, where I was working at the time and going to school. And John had become, as we covered in the film, John had become intrigued with Bill Mueller. He was like, "How does this guy know so much about everything? How has he told you so much?" And John began to suspect, he thought maybe Bill Mueller had been on the Frankfurt that night. So John and a couple of the trustees of the museum drive up from rural Ohio. They drive up to Canada. They get to the rest home where Bill Mueller, who's 95, 96 years old, is living. And they start talking. He starts interviewing him. And as the interview goes on, Bill Mueller just keeps putting himself closer to the Titanic disaster. And finally, John says, "Well, were you at sea that night?" And Bill Mueller says, "Yeah, of course I was at sea that night." And he says, "Well, if I can ask, what ship were you on?" Fully intending that he was going to say the Frankfurt, the German liner. And Bill Mueller says, incredulously looks at him like he's an idiot, and says, well, I was on the Titanic. What do you mean, what ship was I on? So the next call, was John calling Diana and saying, did you know this? And of course, Diana did not know this. Okay. And this was a complete shock to her. And I think everybody was very skeptical. It's like, is this guy telling a fairy tale here? Is this guy looking for notoriety or fame? And it just didn't seem that way. He was an old guy at the end of his life. And I think what really happened was he had a story to tell. He wanted to set the record straight. He had tried to do that in 1962 when he wrote an extensive article on the Titanic disaster for the 50th anniversary. Nobody paid attention to him in 1962. And so when Diana flew up, she got the whole story when she interviewed him for 2 days in Canada. But the story that she did not anticipate getting from him was the story about the stewardess, Gwen. And when him and his boss went on the ship, and his boss was, of course, the Dutch traffic inspector who was there to inspect Titanic for the bankers and the investors and whatnot. And Mueller was his young apprentice secretary who was, following behind him like a personal assistant. The very first thing that happens is Bruce Ismay assigns this stewardess to sort of chaperone them and to guide them around the ship and to show them where everything was at and make sure that they were being taken care of. And of course, this young, pretty stewardess, Bill Mueller, takes a shine to her. And it wasn't by any means a Jack and Rose kind of romance like we saw in James Cameron's movie, but he grew very, very fond of her over the course of the voyage. And of course, as we see in the film, she elects to stay on the ship and do her duty, and she drowns, and he survives. And he had never told, much kind of like Old Rose in James Cameron's movie, Bill hadn't told his story to anybody. And he felt horribly guilty for surviving when women and children died, and particularly Gwen died. So this was really the first time that he ever opened up and told that story. And it was Diana was pretty enamored with that. And this was in, of course, 1989 when she interviewed him. And in 1992, Diana and I began to work on a screenplay. She was working on Titanic Sinking the Myths, and we began to contemplate a movie, because we said there hasn't been a movie about the Titanic in a really long time, and this would be a great story to tell because nobody's heard the story. And then we were going to weave in all the controversy about the Frankfurt and the coal fire and all that kind of stuff, And then we worked on that. The book came out in 95. And then, of course, we began hearing rumblings about James Cameron making his movie. So we never got around to making the movie that we wanted to make. And that's sort of the background behind how I got into Titanic and how this whole project came to be and how we got here.
Ryan, when you ever make this DVD, we want this as a bonus feature on the DVD. What you just said for the last half an hour, I want this as a bonus feature on the DVD. Like, I'm listening to this for your film. I think there's like 2 lines of like on IMDb for trivia and like behind the scenes knowledge. I could write an entire thesis on that right now from what you're giving me. I'm like, please don't let him stop talking. I am eating. Like at one point I had to stop because I'm leaning in further and further away from my seat. I could eat this stuff up forever.
Yeah, that was great. Zack said it perfectly, and I think I said it before. We love this background type of stuff. So thank you for that. You did hit on one thing that I do want to talk about. Okay. And I think that is the main controversy behind this research. And so, forgive me once again, being not a Titanic expert in the slightest, but the way that I kind of get the gist that I get is that George Mueller, or Bill Mueller, sorry, the main controversy is that people don't want to believe what he has to say because there's no record of him being on the Titanic. Is that a good summary? That's a good summary. That's a very good summary. And there's a very logical answer for that.
Number one, Bill Mueller, as the movie documents, Bill Mueller had met Bruce Ismay several years earlier. And Bruce Ismay had taken a shine to Mueller as a young guy who was earning his officer certificate.
Sorry to interject, but just out of curiosity, are Ismay and Mueller meeting and knowing each other prior to the Titanic? Is that something that we know kind of historically accurate? I might not be framing this question the right way. Where
I definitely understand what you're asking.
Okay.
I don't know. I have not seen any definitive proof whatsoever. I'm going again by Mueller's 1962 article that he wrote, and sort of taking him at his word. And Diana did do some other research and she was able to find the family of Hedema living in Friesland, and she did confirm that Tietse Hedema was in fact a traffic inspector. So we do have some independent verification that was obtained around that time that the things that Mueller told her did end up being truthful. So if we have that, then I have to sort of believe that the rest of it is probably true too. But what had happened was, Bill Mueller was born in like 1898. And he was part of the family. He was part of the Greibel, the family that owned the Greibel line, and they were like a cargo line that ran small cargo ships. I want to say like Baltic Sea and stuff like that. And he grew up around Stettin, and he was 14, and he was following the traditional mariner lifestyle. He was being recruited, to earn his second officer certificate, and he was going to go into the merchant marine. He was going to be a sailor. And as part of his studies, he had to write a paper on the history of a line. And he did not want to write about the Greibel line or any of the German lines because that was his heritage, and he didn't want to seem like he was being, biased. So he decided to write a history paper on the Ismay-Ermey line, the White Star line, etc. And so he wrote this paper. According to what he said, one of his professors or one of his teachers knew Bruce Ismay. And he passed the paper to Ismay. And Ismay was so impressed with this history of the line that he invited Mueller to come to Liverpool and meet him at the offices of the White Star Line. So Mueller, who's obviously a fairly young guy, probably 16, 17 years old at this point, he is enamored with Ismay. He really looked up to Ismay and really thought the world of Ismay. And then they run into each other a few years later. Tietse Hedema, as a traffic inspector, he mainly did railroads. And then in the early 1900s, he began to expand into shipping as well. When he began to expand into shipping, that's when he somehow met Bill Mueller. And he hired this young kid, this 17, 18, 19-year-old kid, to come to work for him because this kid knew the lingo of the sea. So he knew he would be very helpful to him as he, went aboard ships, inspected them for bankers, inspected them for investment companies, whatever. So Mueller was working in an official capacity, and there had been an accident at sea, and I forget the name of the ship escapes me at this exact moment. The ship had been lost, and Mueller had conducted sort of his own formal investigation into the loss of the ship and what happened. And they had gone to a convention, and Ismay had a couple of his people at the convention. And they were talking about various shipping routes between England and Australia and whatnot. And at some point, Mueller began to tell everybody in the room all about this accident and what he had discovered in his theories leading to the loss of this ship. So a day or so later, he runs into Bruce Ismay. And Bruce Ismay says, I heard all about your discussion, and I'm very intrigued by your theories. They seem very viable from what my people told me. stop by and see me in Liverpool next time you're there. So again, he stopped by. They met. They had a lot of discussions about the Germans versus the British, and Britain's fear that they were not going to be able to maintain supremacy in terms of a merchant marine, and of course the politics and what was going on in the world at that time, the tensions between the two countries, and as Mueller wrote in his article in 1962, he said Ismay was under a great deal of pressure at that point, and he needed the Olympic, he needed the Titanic, and he needed the Britannic. He needed those three ships in order to be able to make White Star competitive. And so sometime later, when Titanic was getting ready to sail, Ismay was the one who invited Hedema and Mueller to go on the ship. Now, they maintained that when they sailed, that they were in a cabin on B deck, okay, one of the first class cabins. And of course, you always hear people say, "Oh, that couldn't have happened. That couldn't have happened. They weren't there." But the thing to remember is that Titanic sailed. When she sailed, she was 68% of her capacity. So there was plenty of room. There were plenty of cabins. So if Ismay made these arrangements himself and gave tickets to Hedema and Mueller to sail, okay, that would have probably been added last minute. That probably would have been done in the home office. Mm-hmm. It probably would not have made the actual passenger manifest. It was not uncommon for those manifests to be inaccurate back then.
Thank you. I'm sorry to cut you off, but you just hit the nail on the head for what I feel. That's something I've seen some people say, and Zack and I have talked about. There are some people who just go, "This guy wasn't on the Titanic. It can't be the case. There's no way." And it's like, come on, people. This is before the invention of the computer. Right. We've always been bad at record keeping. There's a huge chance that there was at least one person on a Titanic, any ship, that didn't get recorded. Come on.
Well, and I can tell you that there was a story, and I don't remember the names and all the particulars, but there was a great story, a classic example of this. Okay, there were two friends that had taken off, I want to say, out of school, and they had decided to travel the world. And they'd literally traveled from place to place around the world, and they would go so far, and then they would stop and they would work and save some money, and then they would go a little bit further. I want to say I think these two friends were from Pennsylvania. And literally, they were coming home on the Titanic. The Titanic was their last leg in this round-the-world travel that they'd been on. Well, one of them, believe it or not, and again, I don't remember the specifics, but one of the friends gets kidnapped by pirates, okay, and ends up getting put into slave labor on a cargo ship, and it takes him quite a while to escape from these people, apparently. And the other friend, not really knowing what to do, says, do I stay? Do I look for it? What do I do? Well, he ended up sailing on the Titanic, and he took all of their cargo with him, and he was lost. Okay, he went down with the ship. Mm-hmm. The assumption was then made that the other guy, that because they had booked passage and they were traveling together, that they had both drowned. Okay, and I believe that the other guy's family believed that he was dead for a number of years before he finally escaped from wherever he was at and made his way back to the United States. So there you have, that's just one off the top of my head, that's just one story, that demonstrates how inaccurate things could be. Now, they would have had to have had for U.S. Customs. They would have had to have had an accurate passenger manifest when they arrived in New York. And the purser's office would have probably been working on that the whole voyage to make sure that all those papers and all that was in order. So my feeling on it is, if we can ever get into that safe, and we know where the safe is at, and most likely if that, I think Park Stevenson said that in the film, that if this was in a passenger manifest was contained within a leather binder or a leather valet or something like that, it would probably to this day be legible. And I am willing to bet that Hedema and Mueller are on that manifest. And I would love to see that manifest come up, because I would love to see Diana proven correct. I have no doubt in my mind that Bill Mueller was telling the truth. And I think and as I said in the movie, I think with technology and with the things that we have at our disposal today, I think there could very easily come a day when we could get that safe to the surface and we could see what's inside of it. I think that would be fascinating.
I hope so. I would love to get more information, and that kind of leads me to the next thing I wanted to ask you.
Well, let me not to cut you off, but let me.
Oh, sure.
Let me interject one other thing.
Yeah, absolutely.
One of the things that's not in that I just ran out of time. I didn't get it in the film. Was that when the survivors got to the Carpathia, the wireless operator on the Carpathia, Harold Cottam, basically would not answer any media requests. He would not answer anything. Okay, all he began to do was he began morning, noon, and night to hammer out a list via wireless of the survivors. Okay, they felt that it was very important that they try to get as many names transmitted as possible, and so they didn't really respond to news organizations or anybody sending personal messages or anything like that. And one of the names that was transmitted via wireless was Mr. Kinema. Okay. Now, if you look at the translation at the Morse code for Kinema, and you look at the Morse translation for Hedema, it's incredibly close.
Okay.
And our feeling was that it could have been Mr. Hedema and not Mr. Kinema, because one thing we do know is that there was no Mr. Kinema on the ship.
Okay, so there you go.
Another supporting that we really felt that was something that needed to be taken into consideration as well.
You talk about it in the movie. You've talked about it here. You say the phrase in the movie, which kind of resonated with me. New Titanic data. And so I am a statistician kind of at heart, and collecting data is something that, I think about all the time. And the Titanic is really strange to me, because the Titanic isn't something that you can approach from, say, a scientific viewpoint in the way that I usually approach my work, where you have reproducible experiments or things like that. The Titanic is just a ship on the bottom of the ocean, and we just have to gain information about that one event and that one series of moments, on back in 1912. And so kind of my question for you is, maybe not what is new Titanic data. I'm sure that can take many different forms, but I guess how frequently is new Titanic data collected? How regularly are people, whether it be ocean explorers or researchers doing modeling and stress tests like you talk about in the movie, how active is this community in this Titanic research, I guess? Well,
I would say it's to answer your question, two-prong. I don't know that there is new Titanic data. I mean, in that the data, so much of what we know about the disaster was known in 1912. The inquiries, they really did know a lot about what happened. Unfortunately, we sort of my opinion is that a lot of authors sort of glaze over that because they don't understand the context of what they're reading. And that was Diana's whole take on it when she was writing myths. She said, you cannot approach this subject from a 1989 perspective or from a 2018 perspective. You have to think like they thought in 1912. You have to understand science. You have to understand math. You have to understand things the way that they did in order to understand exactly what they're saying. But I will say that there are multiple expeditions being planned right now to go out to the wreck. There's one that's possibly going out as early as like July, I want to say, I think. There is a definite quest by the people who are very much obsessed with the subject matter. There's an ongoing desire to learn everything that they can, you know. And I think that, yeah, I do believe that there's more that we're going to learn. I mean, I'm not saying we know everything about the wreck. I'm just saying that there's probably still some surprises on the ocean floor. There are probably still some things that we don't know how this damage was done, or, you know, we're still debating 100 years later. We're still debating about what the actual ice damage to the ship was. You know, the first 75, 80 years after the ship was lost, it was commonly accepted that there was a 300-foot gaping gash down the side of the ship, and that 300-foot gaping gash is what sent the Titanic to the bottom. Well, then, you know, when they began exploring the wreck and they began looking at what they could see of the waterline, you know, on the ocean floor, they're not seeing any indication of a 300-foot gaping gash. So then it becomes the theory that, okay, she brushed up against the ice and her plates were buckled and it opened up a bunch of seams and it busted a bunch of rivets and all that stuff. The reality of it is that in 1912, at the hearings, the engineers like Edward Wilding, I think it was, and Carlisle, I can't remember his name, Andrew Carlisle, I think. Anyway, they testified at the hearings that, based upon the math, that the total amount of inflow or the total amount of damage to Titanic amounted to about 12 to 13 square feet. So roughly the size of a table.
Wow.
You know, but what happened was the White Star Line, people like J.P. Morgan, who had a great deal to lose, there was sort of a perpetuation of a 300-foot gash because only the biggest, most gigantic, gash from the biggest iceberg on the Atlantic would send a liner as mighty as the Titanic to the bottom. Yep. So there was no interest for decades in correcting or understanding what was actually in the Board of Trade transcript, and then Diana, using that transcript, Diana went back and made her own sort of refined calculations. She came up with a damage area of like 13.14 square feet, okay, and determined that she really only hit the ice in three spots. Okay, 3 small spots on the starboard side was the bulk of the damage. And so, as you can see, we're still arguing to this day, and it hasn't been resolved. We're still arguing to this day over what actually sank the Titanic. Was there a coal fire? At what angle did the ship break up and why? They're still debating this stuff, and I think they probably will be 50 years from now.
Yeah, and I think that's something that I've kind of come to realize in diving into all this Titanic stuff, which I never really had ever thought about before, is that, it is, like I said, just an event that happened that we are trying to gain information about, and a lot of that resides on the bottom of the ocean floor. And so I'm glad to hear that there's still these explorations and expeditions going on to uncover some of this stuff, because that's just neat. It's just the search for knowledge. I appreciate that. Absolutely.
Like the story that I told you a little while ago about, the 2 friends that were traveling, okay? And they thought the one was lost and the other one, that was actually, no one knew that story. And then they were on the ocean floor, they were on the bottom, and they happened upon a steamer trunk. And they went up to the steamer trunk and they used the manipulator on the sub or whatever to try and like open it or move it or whatever, just kind of testing the waters. And the steamer trunk basically sort of just disintegrated and fell apart. Well, within that trunk, they scooped all that stuff up and they put it in a recovery basket and they took it to the surface. And that's how they learned the story behind what happened. So I think behind these 2 friends. So I think what is really interesting to me is the stories, the humanity side of the disaster, that there's baggage and luggage in that ship, that potentially every bag that you get out of the wreck holds another story that you didn't know. It tells a narrative of someone's life that didn't make it off the wreck and can't tell that story for themselves. And so I hope very much that the expeditions and the recovery continues. There's always an argument when you have something like this. You shouldn't touch it. It's a grave. It's a grave. It's a grave. And I'm not into desecrating graves, obviously.
Sure.
But I feel at the same time like sometimes you have to number one, you have to understand that probably the bulk of the people that perished on the Titanic were washed off of the ship. Okay, they didn't actually, the bulk of them didn't actually, I don't think, go to the bottom.
Okay.
So it's not like there's 1,500 lost souls down there on the bottom, and I'm not minimalizing that loss of life by saying, oh, they were washed off the ship, or they drowned at the surface, or they died of hypothermia or whatever. But my point is that everywhere you look on the Titanic site, it's not a graveyard. Okay. And I feel for the people who did go to the bottom. I feel for those souls who were lost. But, we have an opportunity. Titanic is a great learning experience. They know more now about what happens to a shipwreck in that cold of water at that depth. Okay, they've learned more from Titanic for the sake of science, okay, than probably any other experiment that we've learned from on the bottom of the ocean. You always hear we know more about space, frankly, than what we know about our own inner space that we have. The oceans are largely still a mystery. And the Titanic, we know, is going to continue to disintegrate. And, I've heard people say, oh, it's going to be gone in 20 years. Titanic will not be gone in 20 years, okay? Titanic will be here probably 500 more years. I don't know if we will be, however, at the rate that we're going. But Titanic will be around, and she's going to slowly disintegrate. She's going to slowly melt away. So my feeling on it is, what does it hurt, okay, as the ship slowly roads away to fetch that baggage and to fetch the purser safe and to fetch things that are culturally or historically interesting and bringing them to the surface? I think we're actually doing, when we do those things, I think we're actually doing more to honor the people who were lost than by leaving the whole thing alone and not touching it. This way, we're going to find stories. We're going to have narratives to tell that would have not been remembered or known in any other way.
Exactly. That's a great point. Personally, I've never heard the. I'm sure I have heard some similar argument, but I've never heard it for the Titanic. I've never heard anyone say that we shouldn't investigate the Titanic because it's a grave. But even though I haven't heard it, I totally believe it that people would have that opinion. But I agree with you, Ryan. This is a learning experience. This is not just a learning experience about maritime disasters and those conditions, but a learning experience of, what those stories were. And that's important. Right off the bat, though, I mean, it wasn't intended to be a grave. That's the first thing I think of is what water, or no pun intended, what water does the argument hold that we shouldn't desecrate a grave if it wasn't intended to be a grave first off? Like, there was no one who went on the Titanic and thought the whole ship was going to sink or anything like that. Right.
That is a valid point. I mean, these people thought that they were crossing the Atlantic on this beautiful floating palace,
Yeah.
And none of this was ever supposed to happen, But I really do believe that, as a prime example, for instance, we thought when we found the wreck in '85, I say we, the American-French expedition, they thought Titanic was rusting. This was all rust that was covering the wreck and all that. And then what do they learn later is that it's not rust at all. It's not even close to being rust. Okay. It's actually bacteria that is eating the iron ore. And as the bacteria, the waste of the bacteria is the rust sickles that we see hanging off of the wreck is actually just waste. And so the wreck is literally being eaten. And we did not know that. I mean, we did not know that about the deep ocean and what existed at that depth, and what materials would be eaten and what materials would not. For instance, something I learned of recent, it's like we see the shoes, okay, and we see multiple pairs of shoes on the ocean floor, but you also see leather luggage and stuff like that. And the leather will survive no matter what, because what we've discovered is the bacteria will not eat the leather, because the bacteria does not like the acid, the tannic acid that is used when they cure leather. So, I mean, these are all amazing things that are, I mean, I'm not going to do anything with them personally, but some scientist somewhere, someone who is developing pharmaceuticals, okay? I mean,
Yep.
You have no idea what cures we could find if we just maintain our curiosity, and continue to explore wrecks like the Titanic and the rest of the ocean for that matter.
Yes, Ryan, you are speaking my language. Like you said, what are we going to do with these things personally? Probably nothing. I don't know what I'm going to do with this information you just told me. It's awesome, though. I love it. But, I'm like I've said multiple times, I'm from a completely different field. I spent, like a whole summer in Montreal once just studying some very abstract math idea called percolation theory. And people would say, what is the point of this? Why are you doing this? And I said, I don't know, but someone else will. That is important. Right. We as humans are not just the one person can do everything. It's a stepping stone process. And right. And I make the big example all the time. I'm sure Zack is rolling his eyes right now because I'm making references to math. But Bernoulli's principle was proven in the 1700s, and it is the basis for airplane flight. There's no way that Daniel Bernoulli in the 1700s was like, oh, this is going to let things fly, and public transportation is going to be amazing. He was just like, look at this feature I've understood and realized about the universe. I've formalized it. Someone do something with it. And yes, it took 200-something years, but now we have all of this great technology. And so, yes, we should search for these answers. We should search for this information, because it's not who cares, it's why don't we have it already? Right.
I agree completely.
Well,
great.
Okay, there's a lot in there, and I've been quiet for a while because I've just been absorbing all this. Just to push back on the whole idea of the wreck being a memorial site, I don't think anybody. This is more devil's advocate. Rob hates it when I'm indecisive, but I'm being indecisive here. Is that I don't think anybody minds Jimmy C. My nickname for James Cameron. He's Jimmy C. I don't think anybody minds him going down there, or like National Geographic. You probably know more than I do, Ryan, is that a lot of rich SOBs go down there and they treat it like a tourist destination, where they pay a private firm and they just go through it, and there's not really any sort of care taken when exploring the wreck, as opposed to someone like Jimmy C. or National Geographic.
Well, fortunately, the thing about there have been, as I understand, yes, there have been some tourists. Companies, some charters that have gone out there. The fortunate part of that is there's not very many, and there's not very many people who can afford to do that at $150,000 a ticket, to go out there, and also there's not a wealth of technology and a wealth of submersibles and equipment that can get to that depth. So thankfully, that really sort of keeps the site, that really sort of does a lot to protect the site in and of itself. People just can't get there, easily. I don't really think, I don't know, I've heard that there's been some damage caused, even by the legitimate researchers that go down and they leave the submersible weights, on the deck, or there was one expedition where I think they ran into the overhang on the stern, trying to get in to look at like one of the screws, and so I mean, but I think more than anything, I think the greatest the greatest threat to the Titanic above anything is just the natural process of her breaking down and her deterioration. That to me is the biggest. I think that's the biggest threat. Although I don't want to see anybody go down there and scavenge the wreck or
well, because the only thing is I've heard stories, and again I told you in the past, is that I've heard so much information from so many different angles. It's hard to remember which things were correct. It's because I remember somebody telling me a story, and again there is a lot of misinformation. Is that the original plaque or there's dozens of plaques down there.
Uh-huh.
I think one of the first ones that Bob Ballard put down there is gone now, and they don't know whether somebody took it or just the air compression of the submersibles going down there just blew it off the deck, and it just gets lost in the sand.
You know, it's really funny you mentioned that, because I had a discussion with somebody about this recently, or I was in on a conversation about this, and it seems to me like it was, I want to say, and I don't want to get this wrong, but I want to say I think that it was maybe Dr. Ballard who decided that he was going to remove some of the plaques because there were so many of them that were accumulating right there on the wheelhouse, or what's left of the wheelhouse. And but again, I don't know if that's an accurate statement or not. I'm going off of memory, and I'm trying to remember who told me that and how. But yeah, you've heard something similar to what I've heard.
Oh yeah, because another thing. Because again, now I can just go into all my questions I have for you. I don't feel bad now, just interjecting all these. I think you've opened up the board to all sorts of stuff. Because another thing I heard, and I just heard this recently, is that I heard a story, and I heard it, and I automatically, a little red flag went up in my head that said, error, danger, Will Robinson.
Mm-hmm.
And they said that the wreck was originally found in the 70s, and the Germans found it and couldn't report on it because of insert Cold War reason here. And then the British found it again I guess it was found again in the early 80s, and they couldn't report on it because insert Cold War reason here. And it wasn't until Bob Ballard found it in 85 that eventually did.
Let me put it like this. I've read enough stuff about this that I would not rule it out. Let me put it like that, Zach. Okay, I don't think that it's far-fetched that the British found it. I had not heard that the Germans found it. I had heard that the British found it in 1977 while they were on another exercise doing something else. And the story went that like one of the sonar operators or radar operators or whatever had seen something on the bottom and was like, oh my God, there's two massive things down there or whatever. And he was told by like one of his senior officers, oh yeah, that's the Titanic. And it was just like this, they commonly knew where the wreck was at. They knew right where it was at. And then they kept as I understood it, the reason that we couldn't talk about it was because, for instance, the United States, here's that Cold War, insert Cold War reason here. We had listening devices on the bottom of the ocean. And one of the things that we did not, and the British were the same way, we had all this technology, such as being able to listen and do all these things. And they did not want to tip their hand. They did not want to say, well, we found the Titanic, because then it sort of exposes what our capabilities are. And everybody kind of wanted to sit on their capabilities and not reveal, what they could do, what they could find, what they could hear, what they could see, kind of thing. So that's kind of the theory that I had read a while back. Now, again, I can't attest to whether it's true or not. What I do know, however, is that there was some interesting timing behind when the news broke that Ballard found it. Okay. And it was like, the rest of the world, like in England or in one of those places, they broke the story before, if I remember right, before Ballard actually announced that he had found the wreck. It was like the newspaper was going to press, and they did not want to leave out the story that the Titanic had been found for the next day. So they went ahead and put the story in. And again, I can't remember where I heard this or what website this was on, but I definitely remember reading this. And so I don't know, did they find it maybe before 1985? I think it's entirely probable or possible that could have happened.
Well, the reason why I ask is because, like I said, is it feasible? Sure. Why not? But my thing is that, and I've told you this in our private conversation, but for our listeners, every time there's like even a minuscule new amount of evidence or information about Titanic, History Channel, Smithsonian, Lord knows who else, puts like 16 documentaries in production. They'll take that one bit of information and they'll make a new 4-hour-long documentary about it, where it's just, again, it's 2 hours of the poor people in steerage. Like, that's one thing Rob and I brought up too, is that your film, like every Titanic documentary, no matter how long it is, could be 15, 20 minutes, an hour, 2 hours, at least 50%, if not more, is devoted to the socioeconomic layout of the passengers. And your film bypasses that, which again, that alone, it's in the top 1%, just for that reason alone. But, and that's, go ahead.
I didn't need to do that. That, as you pointed out, that has already been done. That's already been, very well established that yes, the steerage passengers were not necessarily, treated fair and given an equal chance to save their lives or have access to the lifeboats. And we've heard the stories about Benjamin Guggenheim, who dressed in his finest and waited to die while sitting by the grand staircase and drinking a brandy. John Jacob Astor and his we know all of these people. I did not need to waste any time really focusing on them. I think I mentioned that I put Isidore and Ida Strauss in the film just to have some kind of connection with the pop culture element of the story or whatever. But I just didn't. I felt like there was a far greater and far more interesting dynamic going on between your players like Thomas Andrews and J. Bruce Ismay. I find it very hard to believe that Ismay. I subscribe to Diana's theory in the book that Ismay was definitely overstepping his bounds as the chairman of the line, that Ismay was definitely usurping the captain's authority and making calls about navigation and this and that. The whole I always love when I hear people say, oh, well, Titanic couldn't have taken the Deutschland, the tanker that was drifting. She couldn't have taken the Deutschland under tow. That's entirely improbable, blah, blah, blah. Why else then did Captain Smith hand Bruce Ismay the Baltic's ice warning on Sunday at lunch? Okay, because the second part of the message, and again, this is another classic example of what Diana came up with. Okay, every other book, every other movie, every other narrative before Diana said, on Sunday morning, the Titanic received an ice warning from the Baltic, advising it of ice that lay ahead. And of course, there's that sort of, if she would have only paid attention to that warning, she would have been fine. But then when Diana went and said, I'm going to go find that original message, and she finds the original message, what else is on the message? There is a passage on the same ice warning. The captain of the Baltic sends the warning, and then he proceeds to relay that the German tanker Deutschland has got caught up in an ice field, that the tanker has used so much coal trying to navigate through the ice field that she ran out of coal, and now she's drifting, and she's asking any steamer in the vicinity for a tow. Okay, well, when you mapped it out and you plotted it, the Deutschland would have been directly in Titanic's path with a minor modification in her course. Okay, but of course we have to listen to these people that say, that would have never happened. A great big steamer the size of the Titanic can't take a small steamer under tow. It's too much of a risk. Well, how do we know that? Okay, and second of all, if Titanic slowed down to 10 or 12 knots, I think it would have been entirely probable or possible that she could have taken the German liner under tow. And, as we discussed in the film, this would have been huge for Bruce Ismay. This would have been huge for the White Star Line, because now they can say Titanic not only arrived in New York on time, but she's even towing a German liner behind her, which even slowed her down. Imagine how fast Titanic is, under normal circumstances when she's not towing somebody. This was a headline grab for Ismay and for the White Star Line, and it's also why they altered their course, and headed basically into an ice field.
I've told Ryan, for our audience, I've been following the Titanic ever since I was 5 years old. Saw Jimmy C's film 5 times at 5 years old, and I fell in love with it. And I know you don't like this, Ryan, but how I really started to get my beyond, how would you call it, the conventional narrative of the Titanic, when I really started getting into the weeds of this stuff, was with Robin Gardner's conspiracy theory book.
Oh God!
Wait, yes, I know you don't like that, but
it's not that I don't like Robin Gardner's book. I mean, I don't, but it's not just that. Okay, it's the fact that I read Robin Gardner's book and I said, I think Robin Gardner is way off base, and Robin Gardner is definitely reaching hard to try to make this switch theory. There's no way that this is going to work. Where I cringe is because just hearing the name Robin Gardner, or just hearing, the mention of it, it brings back memories of Diana, like screaming on the phone, like, I can't believe anybody would publish this guy. I would have to listen to it. So that's why I'm not fond of Robin Gardner, because I remember listening to Diana. God rest your soul, Diana. I'm sorry, but
hey, we're carrying on a good work. We're trying to spread it with more people as humanly possible. So I imagine she'd be very appreciative of that. But no, that's just how I really got into all this, and I started to learn how they did things. And in my biggest litmus test I always use for new Titanic documentaries, books, is that I don't know how you can tell the story of Titanic and not bring up the Californian. I know I've heard in Jimmy C's film that he says I could have sworn I read something that he says he shot a scene about the Californian's perspective. It was one scene, and it got cut. And I've never heard anything about it ever since. Did you hear that?
Yes. I have that on. I have that on very, very informed knowledge. Yes, there was a Californian set, and there was a Californian scene, as I've been told, and there was also a lot more of the Carpathia than what we saw in the finished film.
That's okay. Oh God, Ryan, dreams do come true. I've been wanting to hear someone corroborate that for so long, because I've heard about this. Is again, you've been steeped in this for what, almost 30 years now.
Right.
I told you, in my circle, I've always been the Titanic expert. I've never been around somebody like this. Is kind of like having a big brother, so to speak. And yet you have somebody to ask these questions to. Oh God.
Yeah, the only thing I can think of is if Jimmy C included these scenes with the Californian, how many more VHS tapes would it have added to the release back?
Probably at least probably 2 more. At least. You cannot, in my opinion, you're 100% right. You cannot have a Titanic discussion without discussing the Californian. Diana was very much pro-Californian. She felt that Captain Lord really got the shaft, and that he became the scapegoat for the whole thing. Her, again, she was the first one. When I talk about the transcripts, and I talk about how people didn't understand what they were reading, or they didn't interpret them. Okay. This was a classic example with Diana. Diana was reading the transcripts, and it's always been reported that the Californian officers, Officer Stone and Apprentice Gibson, or however that I can't remember their exact positions, but they they were on the deck. They saw over the horizon what appeared to be a rocket, right? They call down to Captain Lord. They tell Captain Lord they saw a white rocket, okay? Captain Lord says, we'll signal her with the Morse lamp and see if she replies. They try that. The Titanic does not reply, okay? And they proceed to then, as the narrative goes, do nothing while 1,500 people drown, okay? Diana's reading the transcripts, and when she's reading the transcript, what she picked up on was that that Lord or Stone called Captain Lord, and he told Captain Lord in the chart, who was just napping lightly in the chart room, he told Captain Lord that there was a steamer that was, to their south, and that she was firing rockets. Lord says, well, what kind of rockets? Stone says, white rockets. This became the subject of sort of an exchange between the two of them. And he's like, well, are you sure that they're white rockets? And Stone was like, positive. And that is what prompted Lord, okay, to say, well, signal her with the Morse lamp. In other words, nothing can really be too wrong here, is what Diana read between the lines. So this was what set Diana off on the tangent of studying the rockets. And she went and got an old 1912, 1911 version of the book called Rules of the Road. And Rules of the Road says that in order for a distress rocket to be viewed as a distress rocket, it must throw stars that are color, okay? And then that began a whole debate. Is white a color? Well, Diana and I both went to art school. So Diana and I both have the same understanding of what white is. White is not a color at all. White is the absence of color. And so it was by making this discovery, by reading each line of the transcript and understanding the context of what she was reading, that's how she came up with the fact that if Titanic was firing white rockets, they were a signal most likely to keep away unless you're British.
This was the summer of 2016. I did one of those Audible subscriptions where you get like a summer's worth of a book every month. And so one of the books I chose to listen to, I don't want to say the specific name of the book because I don't want to get the author in trouble. I don't want to start throwing mud at him. But I remember listening to it. This is before your film. I'd seen it. And the entire book was just devoted to the Californian. That's why I chose it. And it spends, God, how many hours calling Captain Lord a degenerate. He was a sociopath. He again, every word in the dictionary for just somebody who's deranged. He was a masochist. He was a sadist. He wanted to see people suffer. And really, if you didn't know any better, you would have sworn this guy really was. He would get in all these horrible things, and like you and Diana both made it clear that he was the scapegoat for this thing. His career was ruined more or less after it.
Exactly.
And then we see your film, and again, like you just said, with the white flares, and it's like, oh, well, there's the explanation. It's a one-sentence explanation. Well, it is. It's I think even Rob would agree, white is the absence of color. You don't, again, white's not again, especially like you said, Diana went and did the research of the context at the time about how it was meant to be deciphered. And I think back to that book, I'm like, and I think the book was published like in 2014 or 15. It was not an old book by any means. It was something within the last 5 years.
I'm pretty sure I read that book because when we began, one of the things I did when we began making Titanic was when they greenlit it was, I also I'm a member of Audible as well. And I go through probably 60, 70 books a year because of how much I commute. And I began to read everything that I could get through Audible, and I remembered reading a book that was like they were very critical of Captain Lord. They talked about how he was, very much an egotist. But the thing that what I really got from my research on Lord, and I got this, and Diana was very much the same way, was that Lord was just a stickler for doing things the right way. Okay, he wanted his crew to act with precision. He wanted them to be, he wanted them to follow the rules. He wanted everybody to toe the line and do what they were supposed to do. So like when somebody comes to him, when one of his officers comes to him and his officer says, there's a ship firing white rockets. Lord knows what a white rocket is for. He knows the definition, he knows what is defined in rules of the road. There is nothing about a white rocket that is going to alarm him or make him say, we must go to her aid right now. You met via the film, you met Larry Fosgate, who was one of Diana's consultants and friends on Myths. And like Larry Fosgate, who has 40 some years worth of experience as a second officer in the Merchant Marine, as he said, there is nothing, you use a white rocket for nothing more than illumination at sea, or you use a white rocket to tell other ships that, hey, I'm right here, and there's something wrong, and I'm not moving, I'm not under power, so I can't steer away from you. So basically stay clear of me, kind of thing. I don't believe personally that Captain Lord owed any duty here. If he thought that those were white rockets and that's what they saw, then they were white rockets.
Rob made the comment in our discussion earlier too that we're 100 years away from the disaster.
Mm-hmm.
And yet there still is this. Okay, you mentioned it back with Diana back during the 80s and 90s, where you had kind of the Titanic. Oh God, how would you? Not to use current terminology, but kind of like the Titanic deep state, if you want to use today's rhetoric, where you have the intelligentsia that set the narrative. Does that still exist today? As of 2018, does that still exist, where there's a group of people that dictate the Titanic narrative?
I can honestly say that's one question that I guess I really can't answer. Primarily just because I don't really, I don't really run in the Titanic circles. I don't really follow along with what's going on. But I know that, like, in any subject matter, whether it's the Titanic, whether it's Amityville, whether it's the JFK assassination, the Civil War, there's always a group of people that are always going to try to control the reins and control the information, and they're going to oppose anybody that comes in and says something to the contrary. And that's always kind of what I felt about Diana. So many people tried to make Diana sound like this cranky charlatan, or tried to make her sound like, she didn't know what she was talking about, because they had to discredit her. Because when she came to me and we published the book in 1995, the way that came about was she had this literary agent. Again, you met him in the film. That was Michael. I forget his name. He's Ed Asner's son-in-law, and he's a great actor. And he plays Gus, Diana's literary agent. And actually, there were two literary agents. There was Gus and there was Bert. And they had told Diana from the beginning, they're like, you're going to have a hard time selling this book. Why? Because no woman is supposed to know more about the Titanic than a man. And in this particular case in the 80s, Walter Lord was still God. Okay, he had written A Night to Remember. He had come out in around, I think it was 86 or 87. He did a follow-up book called The Night Lives On, and Walter Lord was basically sort of idolized by the Titanic establishment. He was the guy that started the whole obsession for many with Titanic. And Gus and Bert told Diana, they said, look, what's going to happen here is that you're going to write this book. It's going to be a really great book. Okay. We're going to take it to the New York publishers. We're going to show it to them. The New York publishers are going to turn around. They're going to read this controversial book, and they're going to say, well, we need to take this manuscript and we need to have it fact checked with an expert who knows the Titanic. So guess what? Who is that? That's Walter Lord. You send the book over to Walter Lord or to any of the other emerging stars at that time, okay? And they're going to come back and they're going to say, this woman is batshit crazy, okay? This woman doesn't know what she's talking about. She's way off base, blah, blah, blah. And the book is rejected. The book never gets published, okay? And guess what? 2 or 3 years later, one of these other authors just retools and reworks the manuscript, and voila, comes out with a brand new book with her findings in it. And when she first told me this, I thought it sounded like a paranoid delusion, you know? And she was the first one that ever said to me, she says, just remember, I'm not paranoid if they really are out to get me. And I thought that was pretty funny, but she came to me and she convinced me. She's like, my book is going to get stolen, and we need to publish the book. And I'm running an advertising design. I'm running a creative services firm, okay? And I still do part of that today. You know, I still have clients that I work for, but you know, I'm like, I know nothing about publishing at all. I mean, I'm going to have to learn the ropes on this and figure out how to do this. And, you know, we did. You know, I ended up getting a distributor and we ended up selling the book worldwide. And the book did, you know, pretty good for, you know, the first year or so that it was out. And then it kind of trickled off. And then at one point, Diana and I had a short falling out with each other for about a year or so. And then it, you know, worked that out and went back to being great friends because we were friends for like 20 years. And we had just kind of let the book go off the market. And what amazes me now is that there's such a demand for that first edition book. You know, I probably get somebody at least once or twice a week that asks me, where can I get the book? And the answer is right now, nowhere, because it's out of print. I think I probably have like 100 copies of it left, if even that.
I was one of those people that harassed you looking for a copy. This is how I met you. Like, I don't know what to tell the story that it took to get a copy. Oh God, they're sinking the myths, because it's funny, Rob. Earlier today we were talking about, because I found a website that has like I think the guy who ran the website stopped updating it, I think in the mid 2000s, but he ranked every Titanic book published. And he had a little
right.
And he had a little key that labeled each of the books like their difficulty or their like scarcity within the Titanic community. And for Sinking the Myths, I think it was ranked like a level 3, so it was like right in the middle. It's like, oh, it's available, but you might have to go out of your way to find a copy of it. And then like RIP was listed at if you find this, you buy it and you just like dive on it like a hand grenade. It's like, because you do not want to let this thing go. If you find RIP, you just found yourself a unicorn, okay? Because they basically do not exist. I mean, I have one copy of it, and that's the copy that Diana autographed, you know, to me back in there you go, back in 19. My baby, my baby, my precious.
I hate to ask what you paid for that thing.
Okay, you want to hear a fun story about? Okay, I'm gonna go look up right now. Is that for both my copies of my Diana books? I got lucky. This one ever since your film debuted on Reels, I checked I added it to my Amazon wish list, and literally every hour while I was awake, I checked my Amazon wish list until it appeared. And I got it for $18.
You know what? You bought that book when I released a handful of them out to Amazon because I was being harassed. And so I was like, okay, I'm gonna release some to Amazon. So I released, I don't know, 30, 40 of them to maybe 50 of them to Amazon, and then that was it. You know,
Well, what happened was I was expecting that to happen because you said you released some to Amazon, and I just religiously checked, waiting for that. Like I set up like Amazon, every single tracker that's in existence for like getting products on Amazon. I set up something for it. Like I learned so much from that, and because I think you told me that I think in like February of last year, and so I kept checking because I was chomping at the bit for this thing. and it showed up as a third-party seller. A third-party seller was selling it for, I'm checking my Amazon account right now, for $18 with $4 shipping. And
Nice.
I dove on it because I figured there's no way I'm getting a better deal for this. Especially, like, it never showed up on eBay, nothing like that.
I published a book called The King is Dead. And it was the second book that I published after Titanic, because we did Titanic with Diana, and we had so much fun publishing, and we learned so much. We were like, hey, we should keep doing this. Let's just publish like historical nonfiction stuff, you know, and we'll publish a couple books a year, and we'll be a little niche nonfiction publisher, and let's do that. And so the next manuscript that I get was from my lawyer. And he sends it to me and he says, look, this is a friend of mine who wrote this. It's about Elvis Presley. And I want you to read this and tell me if you're interested. And I'm like, I don't want to do a book about Elvis Presley. I'm like, there's been so many books about Elvis, and, you know, this is not going to be some book that's like talking about how he lives in Michigan in a mobile home park and works at Walmart or anything like that, is it? And he's like, no, I promise. It's, you know, you'll enjoy it. So he faxes it to me. I throw the fax like on my desk somewhere. A week later, he calls me and he starts harassing me. He's like, what do you mean you didn't read it? And I'm like, well, I haven't read it yet, but I'll read it today. And I promise him I'll read it. So I start reading. I read the first 10 pages, and I called him and I said, I want this book. Let's sign this. Let's get this done. The book was written by Elvis's funeral director. And
wow.
It was the minute-by-minute narrative of what hell this guy went through pulling off this gigantic funeral effort in like no time. Okay. And, you know, it sounded initially sort of macabre, but it wasn't. I mean, it was really just all about the logistics of trying to pull off what Vernon Presley and the family was asking for. You know, I mean, like, for instance, Gladys, Elvis's mom, had died like 8 years earlier, and she had been buried in this like fancy $8,000 copper-plated coffin. And Vernon wanted the same coffin for Elvis. Well, they had discontinued it. It was not being made anymore. So the funeral director had to like reach out across the country to find the coffin. He finds one of them, buys it, and has a plane chartered to fly the coffin in. Okay, you know, just craziness like this. Now, the reason I tell you about this is because we published the book, we put the book out, and the very first run of it was like 1,000 copies. And then I did a reprint, and the reprint, which was a much smaller format paperback, was like, I want to say it was like a 4,000 or 5,000 copy run. Okay, not a lot of books in terms of publishing. I mean, we're not a publishing company that turns out bestsellers. Today, if you ever find a copy of The King is Dead and you can buy it reasonably, like I'm talking, if you can buy it for like around the cover price of like $15 or $20, that is another unicorn that you need to acquire, because I've seen those books sell for $400 and $500 on eBay. It's insane. And so I tend to put out books that become collector items, I guess.
Oh man, I can definitely attest to that.
You've sold me. The Elvis funeral director story sounds amazing. I'm going to start running down the thrift stores looking for this.
It was a really well done book, and it was actually my first development deal with 20th Century Fox. Was they picked it up and they wanted to make it as a film, and then it kind of became discussions like they were going to make it as a dark comedy at that point, which was I wasn't a real big fan of, but you know, once you sell rights to something to somebody, and I had just a little tiny producer credit on it, so it wasn't like I was calling the shots. But then that didn't get made either. So I've got a book and a script laying around here, you know, somewhere. But it was a really fun. I don't want to say fun, but it was a really interesting read. The King is Dead.
You said you published it when, August '94?
August of 04 was a reprint, I do believe. And
94.
Yeah, no, not 94, 04.
Oh, okay. Because I'm finding something called The King is Dead, by Paul Salmon?
No, The King is Dead by Robert Holton.
Robert Holton. Okay, so I'm looking into it.
On my list too.
Okay. I did find it. Okay, out of print in big bold letters. big bold letters. Not even like small print.
It's out of print in the world. I have a bookshelf sitting here that's got a bunch of copies on it. So,
is that your retirement, Ryan? Is that if this whole documentary thing doesn't work out? Just keep all these books.
That's my retirement. That is indeed my retirement. I figure that by the time that I am ready to retire, these things I should be able to get a couple $1,000s each for them at that point. So
Yeah, I'm imagining in sometime in the future we'll get a call from you, Ryan, and say, "Hey, Rob and Zach, you still want copies of those books?"
But to get back to the book story real quick, was that what happened initially, I was waiting for Sinking the Mist, but I found the Amazon page for RIP. So I added them both, and obviously I checked for them both. And then one day, somebody put up RIP before Sinking the Mist. And I'm like, oh my God, this is even better. This is the hard one, the really hard one to find. And it was like some sketchy, like third-party seller. And I sent them, I did it through Amazon, so I was safe with my money. And like a month went by, and I'm like, where's my book? And they're like, oh, we're having a hard time locating it. Cancel the order. I'm like, I'm not canceling the order. I want my book. And so I contacted Amazon customer service, and I talked to the woman, and I told her the exact story. I'm like, I've been loving Titanic since I was 5 years old. My kindergarten teachers wanted to put me on ADD medication because of James Cameron's movie. They were able to convince everybody that I didn't need ADD medication because I sat through a movie 5 times of my own volition. And so the woman's like, that is the greatest story I ever heard. And so she refunded me my money and gave me like an additional 100% on top of it. So I actually doubled my money. I'm like, how are you able to do this? She goes, because I was making her laugh through it. Like I was telling her all these stories about, and she gave me double my money. I have no idea how she did that because I got double the money from what I paid. And so I'm like, okay. I'm like, so Ryan, you actually helped buy both books for me because when I did get, so like, and then when Amazon officially, or I guess Amazon proper sold Sinking the Mist, I bought it again, and just so I had additional copies because everyone wanted to sit there do something with it. And then it was September of last year is when I found RIP, and it cost me around $36, which I think is pretty bad. That's a solid price for that book.
Yeah,
and that's when I sent you, right? I actually did get a signed copy of it.
Yes, I remember that. And Diana, she would do those. She would just sign, decals, and so there's probably some copies of RIP that are or of Myths that are probably out there that have her signature in them.
Oh yeah, because while I was doing research on trying to find this, I came across like numerous like Titanic like web forums from like the late 90s and early 2000s of people trying to get a hold of these books. Right. And they're like, I can't get a hold of these books. I've contacted like the publisher and I guess they said Amazon contacted the publisher, and like I can't find these books. I hope I'll be able to find them soon. And this is from like August of 2001. I'm like, oh geez, this is like March of 2017. If these people couldn't find it 16 years ago, what snowball's chance in hell do I have?
Right.
And then like it was getting me so, and that's another thing I was telling the Amazon woman too. I was telling her all these stories about how I was like tracking this Titanic book down. And it's like it's like you said, it's like this unicorn. It's like the Bigfoot of Titanic books. It's like you have to be like have like the footage in the woods on the shaky camera, the 8mm shaky camera.
Right.
And it's like, and I was making her laugh so much about this because it's just like all these weird. She's like, it's kind of like how I got Rob hooked into this. She's like, I never knew Titanic books were so controversial. And I'm like, there's a whole other world you don't understand about this. There's so much more to this shipwreck than James Cameron and Jack and Rose.
Yeah. I've had people ask me, they're like, Jack and Rose, where do they fit into the story at? And I just do a face palm, it's like Jack and Rose are not real. Okay. They're really not real. My 10-year-old niece knows that Jack and Rose are not real. Okay. So, and no, I have no opinion as to whether they would have both fit on that piece of wood or not.
All right. Well, while we're talking about Jimmy C's film, you already answered the floating door controversy, but I have a second one for you.
Okay.
What is your opinion on My Heart Will Go On? Greatest song ever or the greatest song ever?
The greatest song ever or the greatest song ever?
Yes, you have two choices. They're very different.
I'm going to vote for neither of the above.
Not Celine Dion fan? Aww.
I like Celine Dion's music. I just wouldn't say that's like the best. I think I would maybe pick something by Green Day if I had to pick like a favorite song or something. You know, American Idiot comes to mind.
Oh.
I would love to hear American Idiot over the Titanic, like Jimmy C's movie, where they played My Heart Will Go On. I would love to see a fan edit with American Idiot.
Zack, get on it.